Lydia the Christmas Mouse. Once upon a time, there was a little mouse, and her name was Lydia, and she lived in this big, huge, tall building in a big city, but she lived downstairs in the basement. And the reason she lived in the basement was in the winter, there was a big iron furnace, and she would sleep next to that, and it was nice and warm. But in the summer, when it was hot, she'd go sleep in the corner where it was nice, dry, and cool, and it was a perfect place to live, and she lived a very happy life in the big city. Well, one day, this big storm came along, and there was rain, and there was wind, and there was rain, and there was wind, and the rain washed into the city, and it started to fill that basement. And then Lydia looked down, she was like, oh my gosh, the water's coming higher and higher and higher. Lydia got scared, and she left, and that storm filled the entire basement and wiped out her home. And she had nowhere to live, so she had to move on to the streets of the big city. And it was late in the fall, so then it started getting colder, and she lived in a dumpster in between these two buildings. And one day she looked up and she saw the stores were decorating for a certain holiday, and they were putting up red ribbons and bows. And guess what holiday was coming up?
Christmas.
That's right, Christmas. And then she thought, okay, if Christmas is coming, who's coming along with Christmas?
Santa.
That's right. So she thought, I know what I'll do. Is there any place in the world where you'd rather live than in Santa's workshop and live in the North Pole? So she said, I'm going to move to the North Pole. But she had to figure out how. Then she got an idea. So
Now take the sled.
she's going to get on the sled. So here's what happened. She waited one night, and it was really, really cold. She went up to that tall building again, remember? And she waited, because she knew that Santa would come and visit that building. So she waited about an hour and looked around, and there was no Santa. And she was getting a little bit worried because it was getting a little bit cold. So she waited another hour, and she's looking, and she could not hear anything, couldn't see anything. And she's getting a little sad now because, oh my gosh, it's getting late. Where's Santa? So then another hour goes by, and she's really starting to worry now. She's thinking, Santa may not come, and what am I going to do? And so she was a little bit sad, so she started to walk back towards the building to go downstairs where it was warm. And just as she started to open the door, she heard a faint sound. And she looked back up, and as soon as she kind of stood outside, it got louder, and it was it was the sound of jingle bells. Now, who drives something that has jingle bells?
Santa.
Santa. And what did she hear? The jingle bells are put on what? Who has the jingle? The sleigh. So she's like, oh my gosh. So she's looking, and suddenly she looks up in the sky, and she sees 8 reindeer and a sled flying around, and she's watching, and the sleigh comes in and lands right on top of the building in front of her. And it was the most amazing sight she had ever seen. 8 reindeer in this big, beautiful red sleigh. And guess who was on the back of the red sleigh?
Santa.
Have y'all heard this story before?
No.
Wow, so it was Santa, and she's like, oh my gosh. So Santa gets off the sleigh, and he grabs his bag of toys and gifts, and he looks around, and he walks straight into the building to go deliver the toys. So Lydia looks around, and she doesn't see anyone looking, and the reindeer are catching their breath because they're tired. So she runs over, jumps into the back of the sleigh, and in between the sleigh seat and the bottom, there's a little space about that big, and she just pops right in there. And so she is sitting underneath the seat, and she's waiting on Santa. So she waits a few moments, and suddenly the door opens, and here comes Santa. And he's got the bag of toys in one hand, and guess what he's got in the other hand?
Present. Cookie.
He's eating a cookie, of course. So he gets on the sleigh, and he grabs the reins, and he goes, reindeer, fly! And he whips the sleigh, and suddenly the sleigh took off and went straight into the air. And Lydia had never flown in a sleigh full of reindeer. And it took off into the air, and she rode all night with Santa as he delivered the toys at every house that he went to. And it was the most exciting night of her life. Well, soon they finished delivering all the toys, so they start heading where? Back to the North Pole. So she's watching, and she's looking, and it's dark, and you can't see anything at all. And she suddenly sees this little bitty light in the distance, and suddenly the light gets a little bit bigger, and it gets a little bit bigger, and then she realizes there's a building, and this building has these doors, and suddenly the doors come opening wide, and all this light pours out, and all of a sudden these little people start running outside. And what do you think that is? Are you sure you haven't heard the story?
I've read the book.
Oh, you've read the book? Good. That's weird. It's not out yet, but good. Anyhow, so they come running up, and the sled comes in and lands, and everyone's cheering, and everyone's applauding. And all of a sudden, this woman walks out who's dressed in red, and she has a cup of hot chocolate for Santa. Who do you think she is?
Mrs. Santa.
It's Mrs. Santa.
Claus.
So she has him. Santa stands up, and he goes, y'all did such a great job this year. We had the most successful Christmas ever. We had a lot of good girls and boys out there. It's been a great year. So now it's time to rest. You've done a wonderful job. We'll get ready to do it again for next year later. So the elves, some of the elves took the reindeer and started taking off their harnesses, and they put them into the reindeer barn. And then the other elves helped with the sled. They pushed the sled up into the sled barn. Meanwhile, guess who's hiding underneath that seat?
Lydia.
Lydia's hiding in the seat. So she waits and she goes inside the barn and she looks around and she doesn't see anybody. So she thinks, now's my chance. So she jumps off the sled, and as soon as she jumps off the sled, something grabs her and holds her up to his face, and it's an elf. And he's holding her and he's looking at her and she's looking at him, and he's like, who are you? And he's like, no, who are you? She goes, I'm Lydia. I'm a mouse. And he goes, well, I can see that. And she goes, well, who are you? He said, I'm Barney. I'm the elf. And she goes, aren't you supposed to be in bed? Barney says, I'm not a toy-making elf. I'm a security guard elf. I watch over the sled at night while everyone's asleep. And he said, what are you doing here at the North Pole? And she goes, well, I come to live here. I lost my home in a flood, and I have nowhere to live, and I was hoping you'd let me stay here. So Barney's like, ooh, I don't know about that, but tell you what. And Barney liked her. He could tell she was a cute little mouse. So he said, let me take you inside, and you can hang out there, and tomorrow morning you can talk to Santa. So he takes her inside and takes her into the kitchen, Santa's kitchen, and hands her, says, here, and hands her a cookie. And she takes one bite out of it. Oh, my gosh. It is the best cookie she's ever eaten. It was so good. And Barney and her sit, and they just kind of wait because it's, late at night, and he's got to, he's the elf that watches over the...
He's a security guard.
He's a security guard elf. Thank you kindly. So, that's right. So what happens is, the next morning, he goes, look, I got to make some coffee because everyone's going to start getting up. So he goes over and he starts making the coffee. Suddenly, another elf walks in. And the elf walks in, he sees a mouse sitting there, and he's like, who are you? She goes, I'm Lydia. Who are you? And he goes, oh, I'm Carl. I'm the boss elf. Why are you here? And so Lydia explained to him that I don't have a home, I have nowhere to go, and I want to stay here with you. And Carl looks a little bit nervous, going, I'm not sure about if we can do this. I don't know if we can do that. We have to send you back. About that time, Mrs. Claus walked in. And she looked down, she goes, who is this beautiful little mouse? And Carl explains to her, this is Lydia. She has no home, she's come to live with us. So Mrs. Claus puts her arm around Lydia and gives her a little hug, saying, well, welcome, dear. We're so glad to have you here at the North Pole. Can I get you another cookie? And she's like, yeah, I'd like to have a cookie. And in the background, they suddenly hear, ho, ho, ho.
Uh-oh.
You know who that is?
Santa Claus.
Suddenly the doors opened up, and it's Santa Claus. And Santa goes over to pour himself a cup of coffee. He looks down, and there's a mouse sitting below him. He's like, who are you? She goes, I'm Lydia. And he looks at his wife, why is there a mouse in our kitchen? She says, Santa, this is Lydia, Lydia the mouse. She's not Christmas mouse yet. She's come to live with us. And he's like, well, that's good, but here's the thing, Lydia. If you want to live at the North Pole, you have to have a purpose. You have to do something. What do you do? She said, I'm a mouse. I don't do anything. And he's like, well, we have to figure that out. So Carl the mouse said, I wonder if she could make toys. So they took her into the toy shop and they gave her a hammer. Now remember, she's a mouse, so how big is she?
About this mouse.
So they hand her this hammer and she's walking over here with it and she's trying to hold it up and the hammer falls over.
Uh-oh.
And they're like, well, let's try it again. So they handed her the hammer to see because they want her to be able to make toys. And she can't hold the hammer. And she walks over here and she runs over here and the hammer falls. Santa goes, I'm afraid you can't be a toy-making elf. So you may not be able to stay here. We have to find your purpose. And that made Lydia very sad. So then the other elf, what did I say, is it Barney, says, I wonder if she could fly. What if she could fly? What if she could be like the first rain mouse? So they built this tiny little sled, and they hooked up Lydia to it and said, maybe you can be the first rain mouse. And so she starts to run, and she's pulling the sled around, and she's trying to jump up into the air, and the sled will not fly because she's a mouse. She's not a reindeer. And they all agreed that, well, maybe Lydia's not meant to be a mouse, and it was, or maybe not meant to be a reindeer, and she can't fly. Yes.
She doesn't have the magic power.
She doesn't have the magic power that the reindeer have. So it's like, oh my gosh, she doesn't have, what's going to be her purpose? So she's very, very sad. So Mrs. Claus said, look, sweetheart, why don't you come inside the kitchen and keep me company and help me? So Lydia and Mrs. Claus went into the kitchen of the North Pole. And Mrs. Claus makes the best cookies in the world. And she said, I'm going to make cookies. Do you want to help? And she said, of course. So Lydia sat down and she watched her mix all the dough and the egg and the milk. And she made this dough and she spread it out. And then she took the roller and rolled it out. And then she took the cookie cutter, you know what I'm talking about, cookie cutter. Yes. And she cut perfect little circles. And when she lifted it up, there were 12 perfect little cookies sitting right there. She said, Lydia, hand me those 2 containers over there. And one of the containers had red sugar in it and one had green. And Mrs. Claus took it and she sprinkled some of the red sugar on and she sprinkled some of the green. And she knows so that a lot of the red sugar would fall off on the sides of the cookie. because the cookie's this big, and when she would sprinkle it, would fall off to the sides. She did the green, and sure enough, the green sugar would fall off to the side, and there was a lot of waste there. So Lydia said, "Can I try it?" She said, "Sure." Now remember, Lydia's hands are what?
This small.
Very small. So Lydia just takes a big handful of sugar, red sugar, stands in front of one of the cookies, and throws it up in the air. And would you believe every single red grain of sugar landed perfectly on that cookie. There was none on the sides. It was perfect. And she goes, "Oh, do it with the green." So she took the green. She took both her little hands of green sugar, and she threw it up in the air. And every green sugar landed perfectly on that cookie. Mrs. Claus said, "Do them all, do them all." And so she decorated all the cookies with green sugar and red sugar. She popped it into the oven, and then 10 minutes later, she pulled it out, and those were the most perfect cookies in the world. And she said, "Santa, Santa, get in here." And Santa comes running in. "What is it? What is it?" She goes, "I think we found Lydia's purpose. Look." And Santa looked, and he saw the most beautiful sugar cookies in the world, with perfect red sprinkles and perfect green sprinkles. And Lydia said, I did that. And he looked at her, and he said, "Lydia, guess what? You have your purpose. From this day forward, you will be the official Christmas sugar cookie sugar sprinkler for all the North Pole." And so Lydia stayed at the North Pole and did all the sugar cookies. And if you're really, really good, if you ever eat a red or green sugar cookie and you look at it, there's a good chance, guess who made it?
Yeah.
Lydia put the sugar. So I have brought for you guys sugar cookies from Lydia. And they're red and green. So if you want a sugar cookie, come get one. And that is my story.
Yeah.
Yeah.